and welcome. I am Ladi Akiridoluale. Tonight, Senate President Bukola Saraki returns to the Code of Conduct Tribunal to defend 3 counts of 18-count charge brought against him by the EFCC. Former Minister of the Federal Capital Territory, Jumoke Akinjide, moves to enter a plea bargain arrangement with the EFCC on the 650 million naira laundering case against her. Ahead of the 2019 polls, the Joint Committee of the National Assembly agrees on changing the sequence of elections in the Electoral Act. And many people are felt trapped as a 6.4 magnitude earthquake hits the Taiwanese city of Hualien.
And on business news tonight, Kwaibo crude production drops to lowest levels since 2010 following series of attacks by Niger Delta militants.
And in sports news, African champions Nigeria drawn with Australia, Turkey and Argentina in Group B of the FIBA Women's World Cup.
And from Abuja, President Buhari visits Nasarawa State, vows to ensure suspected herdsmen and other bandits behind the killings in Nigeria's north-central region are punished.
We begin tonight with the resumed trial of the Senate President, Dr. Bukola Saraki, at the Code of Conduct Tribunal for alleged false declaration of assets. The Senate President today closed his defense after calling out just one witness. Although the Senate President had, through his counsel, Paul Osoro, announced at the commencement of the proceedings that he had lined up 4 witnesses to testify in his favor, he ever made a U-turn when the legal team decided to limit themselves to the first witness only. The Court of Appeal had nullified the ruling of the Code of Conduct Tribunal, dismissing 15 of the charges against the Senate President and ordered him to respond to only 3 counts, prompting Dr. Saraki to return to the tribunal. Our correspondent, Amaka Okafo, has the report.
After more than 7 months, when the case of false declaration of asset filed against the Senate President was dismissed by the Code of Conduct Tribunal, the Senate President, in the company of some lawmakers and well-wishers, makes his way into the tribunal. Soon after, the tribunal commences its sitting as ordered by the appeal court, which had held that the Senate President had a case to answer with respect to 3 out of 18-count charges brought against him. A 3-man panel of the appeal court, led by Justice Tinuade Wilson Akomolafe, had on December 12, 2017, nullified 15 out of the 18-count charges brought against the Senate President, Dr. Bukola Saraki, and ordered the Senate President to defend himself on counts 4, 5, and 6, which had to do with how he acquired his properties on number 17A and 17B, MacDonald Street, Ikoyi, Lagos. Specifically, in count 4, the Senate President is accused of making a false declaration of asset at the end of his tenure as the governor of Kwara State in 2011, shortly after the lone defense witness is cross-examined by the prosecution counsel, Rotimi Jacobs. The tribunal chairman, Mr. Enladi Umar, asked the parties for submissions as to the next step in the trial. Mr. Kanu Agabi, lead counsel to the Senate President, confers with his client, and at the end of the conversation announces that the defense would like to close its case. Counsel to the Senate President explains why they decided to close their defense.
We had more than sufficient materials in, and the rest of the things can come in the address.
While the counsel to the EFCC expresses surprise that the defense closed its case.
Well, I'm surprised that they called only one witness and close their case. It's at their discretion. So everything is addressed now.
With this development, the 2 parties will on February 27th address the tribunal on contentious issues only, after which a date for final judgment will be fixed. Ambaka Okafo, Channels Television News.
Still on legal matters, the scheduled trial of a former minister of the Federal Capital Territory, Ms. Jumoke Akinjide, for allegedly laundering money failed to commence today at the Federal High Court in Lagos. And that's because the former minister has indicated an intention to enter into a plea bargain with the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. Her lawyer, Mr. Bolaji Ayorinde, told Justice Muslim Hassan that arrangements were being made for the refund of the 650 million naira she's been accused of laundering. He said he had discussed his client's intention with the counsel for the EFCC, Mr. Rotimi Oyedepo, and pleaded for an adjournment to allow the parties to continue the negotiations. The EFCC prosecutor confirmed that Ms. Akinjide's counsel had approached him for settlement, but he insists that the case before the court is not merely about the funds which the EFCC had already recovered. He explains that the case before the court was rather about the nature of the funds and the manner the defendants handled them. Justice Hassan has adjourned the matter till February the 22nd to allow the parties to discuss. The EFCC had on January the 16th, 2018, arraigned Ms. Akinjide and two others for allegedly receiving 650 million naira in cash from a former Minister of Petroleum Resources, Mrs. Diezani Alison Madueke. In legislative issues, the Joint Committee of the National Assembly has agreed on changing the sequence of elections in the 2010 Electoral Act. Members of the committee adopted the position of the House of Representatives, which revised the order of the election by fixing the presidential election last as against the current trend. Our correspondent, Linda Akigwe, reports.
On Tuesday, January 23rd, the House of Representatives voted to change the order of elections by amending the 2010 Electoral Act. In the revised order, the National Assembly election would hold first, followed by the governorship and state houses of assembly elections, and finally, the presidential election will come last. But electoral body INEC had on March 9, 2017, announced the dates for the 2019 general elections, scheduling the presidential and National Assembly elections first on February 16, 2019, while the governorship and state assembly elections would hold 2 weeks later on March 2, 2019. But the proposed amendments appear unacceptable to the presidency and across the country, as some caution that the National Assembly is overstepping its boundaries by fixing the sequence of elections in the Electoral Act. Regardless of the disquiet in some quarters over the proposed amendments, the Senate and House of Representatives committees are meeting to harmonize their positions on the amendments.
Election into the office of the President and the Vice President, the Governor and the Deputy Governor of a state, and membership of the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the House of Assembly of each state of the Federation shall be held in the following order. A. National Assembly elections. B. State House of Assembly and Governorship election. C. Presidential election.
Assuming the president ascends within 1 month, INEC will now have about 11 months within which to prepare and supervise and organize the elections. To us, that is sufficient time.
This decision by the Conference Committee on the amendments of the 2010 Electoral Act will be brought to the floor of the Senate and House of Representatives for adoption by lawmakers. Linda Akibe, Channels Television News.
Meanwhile, Nigerians in South Africa agitating to see the diaspora voting become reality have met members of the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, in Johannesburg to push their quest further. The delegation, led by National Commissioner Professor Taye Simbene, was originally on a study tour of South Africa's electoral body, the Independent Electoral Commission, IEC, ahead of the 2019 polls.
And for want of the freedom to vote from abroad came this meeting. Members of different socio-political groupings based in South Africa sought answers to their many questions from the INEC officials.
We in diaspora would like to know the truth. Is there going to be any point in time that there's going to be a diaspora voting?
That we have set up a committee, we have seen the issues, and it means that it's on our table. We are ready to consider it.
But there are tasks that belong to others outside INEC.
There are, of course, legislative and logistical hurdles still in the way of this dream being achieved. But how much hope do the agitators see from the answers they got?
What we wanted was to be able to at least register in diaspora. The INEC has said they form a commission to look into it, and it will be possible. So I'm a little bit happy on it, but I want to see quick action on it. Then I'll be fully happy.
I'm not satisfied because it's clear and obvious that there's no diaspora voting in view. Because that is what we're actually trying to agitate for. And the head of the delegation stated it clearly that comes 2019, there's no diaspora voting.
And for the groups yet to be spoken for, like the members of the armed forces serving abroad and foreign mission officials, will they get to count at some point soon?
The problem is that they are always moving. You might be on tour of duty now, but you are not in 6 months' time or in a year. So these are fine lines that really need to be fine-tuned.
The visiting INEC officials were in South Africa on a study tour of South Africa's Independent Electoral Commission, IEC, as part of efforts to retool ahead of the 2019 elections in Nigeria. From Johannesburg, South Africa, Pt.1, Channels Television News.
We'll leave election matters for a moment. Following the dramatic appearance of the former spokesman of the People's Democratic Party, Chief Olisa Metu, in court on a stretcher yesterday, the House of Representatives is asking the Attorney General of the Federation to look into Mr. Metu's health and the need for him to treat himself so that he can properly stand trial. The motion came up for debate as a matter of urgent public importance, with a member of the House, Chris Azubogu, calling the attention of the House to the urgent need to save the life of Chief Metu. But some lawmakers are opposed to the motion on the ground that it seeks to encroach on the powers of the court. Our correspondent, Lanre Lasisi, has that story.
The former National Publicity Secretary of the People's Democratic Party, Olisa Metu, arriving at the Federal High Court in Abuja for his trial for alleged money laundering. These images led to a motion of urgent public importance in the House of Representatives.
Worried that he is on trial but not yet convicted and his health is deteriorating, further denial for him to receive appropriate medical attention overseas could cost him his life or permanent paralysis.
A point of order is raised against the motion and a debate follows.
I think we should be very careful when it comes to a matter that is directly in the domain of the court. If Olisa Metu is not treated fairly by the trial court, I think the next thing is to go to a higher court instead of coming to Parliament. Let's be very careful so that we don't dabble into a domain that does not belong to us.
We're not saying that they cannot do whatever they want to do. We're not questioning their powers or anything. We're practically begging them. They have a right to beg us because they cannot question our own powers. But we're not questioning, we're only begging. We're urging that please, we've seen what's happening, consider this person.
The question is, what are we going to urge the court to do? A court that has granted bail, a court that adjourned for more than a month. What are we going to appeal to the court to do?
We can't tell the court what to do. Are we in a position to urge the court, as the mover of the motion has sought to do?
We are not trying to sway the judgment of the court one way or the other, but let the accused person be alive. So the proper person that the prayer should be addressed to is the Attorney General of the country himself, who is the chief prosecutor in the matter.
Eventually, the motion is amended, urging the Attorney General of the Federation to look into the matter of the health of the former National Publicity Secretary on the desirability of treating him so that he can properly stand trial.
Those in favor of the motion as amended say aye. Those against it say nay. The ayes have it.
The House is also mandating the Committees of Justice and Human Rights to follow up on the matter and report back to the House in 2 weeks. Lanre Lasisi, Channels Television News.
In part two, after the break, we have more on electoral matters ahead of the 2019 polls. And we have live in our Abuja studio, INEC's Director of Voter Education and Publicity, Oluwole Osanze Uzi, to discuss this. Please stay on with us.